faculty here, the university, and I'm one of the speakers of the panel. And today I'll be moderating this session instead of Tamar Dayan, who could not be here today, but she's with us on Zoom. So this session is going to be devoted to agriculture and biodiversity, and it's going to be a hybrid session. So most speakers will be here, and some will be giving their talk through Zoom. So just before we start, I just want to say again also to congratulate IIASA for their 50th birthday and wish them, as we wish here in Israel, till 120 years, to continue and doing very productive research for humanity and for making this planet and people safer and more resilient. Our panel will start by showcasing all sorts of research, starting from Dr. Piero Visconti from IIASA, who will be talking first for about 20 minutes, and then followed by 6 speakers from various different Israeli institutes. And each one of them will be giving his or her research agenda, and for 15 minutes. I ask the speakers to be very precise and punctual in their time because it's a very long session and we have very limited time. I think we can start.
Yeah, just put the presentation from someone else.
Okay.
Thanks for the invite. Can people online hear me? So forgive me if I'm not going to be very detailed on some of the descriptions that I'm going to give, but I will refer you to my colleagues. Whenever you hear a talk about ecology and conservation, typically you have a first slide which is about how the world is going down, like some declining trends of local biodiversity richness or abundance. I'm going to spare you those depressing slides, but imagine those, however you measure biodiversity, at least in farmland ecosystems, it is generally going down. But I will focus my presentation today on solutions rather than past and present trends and what's going wrong. As Albert mentioned, biodiversity is one of those things that no single sector can deal on its own, and that's why we use system analysis approaches at IIASA. It's fundamentally a list in agricultural systems about water management and crop management and forest management, and there are multiple sectors that deal with these. The EU has recognized the long-standing negative trends in biodiversity and has established essentially a series of packages that deal with biodiversity from many different sectors. These are some of the targets of the EU biodiversity strategy, but at the same time as this, the EU has a comprehensive package and measure that deals with climate change, both in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, aviation, and the more sort of classic sectors that deal with greenhouse gases, but also the land use sectors. There is a LULUCF accounting mechanism and some quotas on those and some targets. For instance, a target of having a net loss from the atmospheres in carbon removals of 310 megaton per year by 2030 just for the LULUCF sector. And if you look at the 50-55 package, which is this package of policies that deal with climate change, mitigation and adaptation, some of those targets actually overlap with those of the EU biodiversity strategy. This is system thinking in a pure essence, having multiple sectors trying to synergize and think about the same targets and agendas. And the same for the farm to fork strategy, which essentially is how do we make food production systems be more sustainable and fair to people. And again, you see that some of the targets are the same. For instance, manage 25% of agricultural land under organic farming. Still, despite this great effort and this really visionary thinking from the Commission, there are many challenges in how to implement this. And in this presentation, I'm going to deal with some of those and some projects that try to address these challenges. First, despite the effort to build bridges and synergies between different agendas, there are fundamental trade-offs that are inevitable. We can navigate, we can explore this trade-off, we can try to find sweet spots, but there will always be some tough decisions that we have to take and compromise to be taken. Secondly, despite this integration, fundamentally, at least at the national and subnational level, would be different agencies, different government agencies, and different private and public sectors, institutions that will deal with these different agendas, which means that there will be different planning and implementation processes, different data sets. Just as example, for instance, DG Klima within the EU has different carbon accounting mechanisms from DG Environment, yet they want to cooperate and think about common ways to monitor carbon emissions and removals, have standardized data sets and metadata and accounting mechanism. And so these are just some of the challenges in the implementation. Also, limited capacity and knowledge for integrated assessment modeling. And this is the work that we do at IIASA, but ideally we shouldn't be always relying just on scientists to do scenarios for this. We should be providing capacity building and understanding to decision makers to do their own. And also policy versus science time frame. If you think about pure research and fundamental research, we like to have 4 or 5 years grants and be visionary and have all the time in the world to do our stuff, whereas the policy time frame is weeks or months. And so how do we reconcile this? The need to actually make decision right now and there, and versus our visionary and ambitious expectations to do science and provide results maybe in 4 years. Then other two aspects which have to do with the data. So ideally, if you're talking about agriculture and biodiversity, what we want to have is large-scale, repeated, standardized surveys of biodiversity, as well as the drivers of change in biodiversity, as in cropland management, water management, forest management, so that you can actually have some kind of causal mechanism established there. And even in Europe, where allegedly we have the best monitoring system in the world together with North America, we lack this. We know very well where some species are, but not necessarily we have the same monitoring in those sites of what is affecting biodiversity in terms of crop management, and vice versa. There is a mismatch between Lucas dataset, for instance, which is looking at land use change, and biodiversity monitoring, whereas ideally you actually have a common monitoring framework and integrated monitoring at the same sites. And this is fundamentally an impediment to have a detection attribution framework. And this is some kind of knowledge gaps. And what I mean by that is, ideally in biodiversity science, just like we do in climate science, you can establish some causal mechanism from your state variable, as in, for instance, abundance of pollinator species, and your drivers, which could be, for instance, use of pesticides and fertilizers. So these nodes there in the network essentially could be either state variable, which basically tells you what is the state of the environment at any given time, or it could be drivers. Some of them are both. For instance, Y1, which is a biodiversity response variable, is at the same time a response to some kind of say crop management drivers or climate variables, but is also an input to some measure of well-being, which could be in people happiness, just knowing the fact that farmland biodiversity is going up. What we need essentially having standardized surveys that allow us to actually understand some kind of standardized effect size, these arrows, with uncertainty that allows us to make prediction. So we can say, if you implement the farm to fork strategy and have 25% of organic farming in Europe, this is going to be, with some margin of error, the implications for such and such ecosystem services. And the other thing that we really need to think about, which is married with uncertainty at the moment, is this Y3 here. We can say with some confidence what are the implications in terms of crop yields if you affect pollinator species in terms of diversity and abundance. But just as an example, we can't really say how is human well-being affected by total extirpation of tigers. Are people going to be upset about it? How many tigers do we need? 100, 1,000, 10,000? what is the threshold that we have to put on these kind of things. And this is just one example. So in essence, we need a good detection attribution framework, both in terms of data and statistical approaches, and we need benefit functions that link biodiversity with people well-being. Wolfgang Lutz yesterday was really going on about these things. How do we connect biodiversity with people mental and physical well-being? Well, we don't know. We have some guesses, but we don't really have good predictive models. And so for the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to present some projects that IIASA is involved with that tries to address some of these challenges. The first project addressed the first 4 challenges. Is called Bioclima. And I co-lead this project with Peter Havlik in the Integrated Biosphere Future group at IIASA. And in this project, essentially what we do is we try to do an ex-ante assessment, a sort of stress test of multiple packages of the European Green Deal. Those that have to do with climate mitigation and adaptation, the Fit for 55 package, especially for what concerns the LULUCF sector, land use change and forestry, and the biodiversity strategy. So as I said, DG Environment on one end, the DG Klima, and the cabinet of Timmermans in the Commission have this big ambition about making the European Union the kind of front runner in terms of climate change mitigation as well as recovering biodiversity. And they're trying to kind of put together this agenda, but there are many unresolved questions. For instance, if you think about afforestation, this target of planting 3 billion trees or extending the amount and quality of forest, you could do that for climate change mitigation, and you would have very different geographies of Europe that you target for those, and many different species that you want to plant, those that grow fast and accumulate carbon very fast. But you could do it for biodiversity, where you perhaps think about set aside and reduced impact logging or close to nature forestry, and you would have more heterogeneous species mix. So what do you do? What is the best trade-off between these things? These are the kind of questions that we try to answer with Bioclima. And we do so basically having 4 different sets of scenarios that explore different ways in which the European Green Deal could be actually implemented by member states. Reference scenario is basically assumes that we do no more commitments in terms of climate mitigation and biodiversity. We limit ourselves to the pre-2020 commitments, and it's basically our baseline that we benchmark everything else against it. And then we have climate mitigation scenarios that basically do nothing in terms of biodiversity conservation, no additional protected areas or restoration actions, or species action plans, and they focus exclusively on the climate mitigation policies, the LULUCF package, close to nature forestry, planting more trees, restoring wetland for carbon rather than for species, and so on. Then we have another set of scenarios that are the opposite. No climate mitigation policies, but just biodiversity policies. And then we look at basically what is the carbon benefit, as the co-benefits for carbon of doing these things, restoring more wetland, restoring more forest, protecting more land. The EU is part of the High Ambition Coalition to set aside 30% of land for as protected areas, and actually is also committed to protect 10% strictly so, unlike other countries in the Global Biodiversity Framework or the CBD. And then finally, a series of scenarios that combine both, and then look really at the bundle of options that we have that make sure that the 2 agendas actually synergize and don't collide with each other. I could spend 1 hour just talking about this. I'm going to focus just on one set of scenarios. We're still with the protected areas and restoration law. So the first thing we do, because we are IIASA and we like to have system thinking, we set some boundary condition. The nature restoration law is not yet enshrined in this law, is still under discussion with the parliament, but the proposal says that 20% of the EU land, not 20% of degraded ecosystems, 20% of land should be under some form of nature restoration, which is a lot. I don't think we can probably afford it if we mean by this that we basically completely set aside 20% of extractive and productive land to bring it back to natural ecosystems. And so what we do is basically we set aside some boundary condition. We use partial equilibrium economic models, the Globion model, to basically ask the question, in 2030, based on different policies that the EU has committed to, how much land would be needed as cropland, as managed forest, as managed grassland, and how much of this is high intensity, medium intensity, or low intensity. And we do so for each of these zones here, which is administrative units called NATS2, so sub-national units. And we basically have information on hundreds or thousands of square kilometers within this NATS2 region that should be dedicated to food production or timber harvesting and so on. And these give us basically the boundary condition. We have to allocate this. Then everything else is up for grabs, so to speak, for restoration and for protection. And so we divide up Europe in 10 by 10 planning units, so grid cells. And then essentially we have a series of management zones, 20 odd of those. And then basically our optimization problem is a spatial multi-criteria optimization problem that basically asks the question, how do you achieve the 20% restoration targets for each bioregion or each country, as well as setting aside 30% of land for conservation, such that you still meet your food production target and timber harvesting target, but you also maximize benefit for species and for carbon. And so our benefit function for carbon essentially is using tier 1 or tier 2 UNFCCC carbon accumulation curves for each transition from one land use to another. We know how many tons of carbon would be absorbed from the atmosphere or emitted, both above ground and below ground carbon. And we also have information for species for the European Environment Agency, which basically tell us, this basically lookup table that tell us for each of these management zones, whether this is habitat or non-habitat for the species. And we have that for 720-something species that are in the annexes of the directive. So these are species that are of conservation concerns, either because threatened with extinction or they are endemic to Europe or have other reasons to be of community importance. And so you basically have to imagine that we can allocate these zones subject to these constraints on this area in order to either or both maximize carbon and maximize conservation status of species. And then because there is an infinite solution to this problem, you could put all emphasis on carbon or all emphasis on species or somewhere in between, you end up effectively with the operator frontier, where each of these dots effectively is a spatial plan. Imagine that you should have 21 maps, one for each management zone, and each of them tells you the proportion of this pixel that is allocated to a different zone. In order to combine them into one, we simply just said, okay, classify production, conservation, restoration. We can say with each grid cell how much of this pixel is allocated to one of these zones. But in reality, it's not just a 3 microzones, it's 21 different land cover land use classes. But for simplicity, I'm displaying it like that. And each dot is basically a different map. It's a different scenario that is putting more or less emphasis on carbon or species. And the axes are in the x-axis, you basically have the biodiversity shortfall, your distance from every species being in favorable conservation status, so having a low extinction risk and population abundance that is such that the species are viable in the future. And on the y-axis, instead, you have carbon shortfall. What is the distance between the maximum possible amount of carbon that you could have across Europe? And so if you have a solution that puts a lot of emphasis on biodiversity, then you are more on the left of this axis. If you have a solution that is put more emphasis on carbon, you are more on the bottom side of the y-axis, and of course you have trade-off. Ideally, you have a convex curve. You have no trade-off, right? So you gain on one asset without losing on the other. Unfortunately, we're finding concave curves, which means that actually we have to make tough choices. These are preliminary results, as the slide says. Hopefully, as we refine the model, maybe we're going to find that there is actually a nicer curve that it's a bit more tricky to navigate than this. And another way to look at the data set is looking at winners and losers. Which functional groups or taxonomic groups stand to gain more in one solution versus the other? What are the species that will be leaving behind, and which are the ones that are going to be benefiting the most? And this is just one side of the story, because of course all of this then goes back to the Globiome model to look at effects such as leakages and displacement and food prices and so on. Very complex, and try to keep it simple, and even if it's not so simple. But just to give you an idea of how you make policymakers think about the complexity of their choices. And again, this is done in collaboration with the European Commission, and we're trying to very hard to produce data as fast as possible, because the nature restoration law is in Parliament now, and as you can imagine, there is strong lobby against it for food security reasons, especially given the current geopolitical turmoils. Farming lobbyists are saying this is just not possible. We need to produce food for our people. And hopefully with these scenarios, we're going to find that actually there are some sweet spots, and it's definitely possible to implement the nature restoration law. Moving on, I was mentioning about detection attribution framework. How do we actually provide the data to have this response function and look at really what happens to individual species or communities in terms of abundance or intactness or richness or any other measure of biodiversity, depending on what you do. As I said, even in the EU, we have, unfortunately, scarce and biased data. And so in this project, Europa Bonn, led by Aviv in Leipzig, and where we collaborate, we're basically using a model-driven data integration. Instead of using one single data set, which could be, for instance, standardized survey or opportunistic observations from citizen science data, we combine all of them using model-driven approaches, for instance, point-Poisson processing. People, for instance, discard often Atlas data or IUCN habitat ranges because they're polygonal data, and if you want to do a species distribution model, you need a presence and absence data or presence of pseudo-absences. But you can actually use both at the same time. You can use the polygon data as your spatial offset, so that in this way you actually close the gap, and you can benefit from multiple data sets to really start an understanding what is the implication for different species of different climate strategy or land use strategies. And in these other projects, instead, we're really trying to address all of these challenges. This is just started, also led by IIASA, by the IBF group, and we collaborate there, Martin Jung and myself from my group, and Tamas Kristin and Peter Havlik from the IBF group. In Bioclima, we kind of opened the Pandora box. We had geographers and economists and land system scientists wanting to work with us to think about how do we make prediction about land use and what it means for biodiversity. And we realized quickly enough that actually the spatial and thematic resolution of those models isn't sufficient. We have many classes for observational data from Copernicus program, and very few classes that can be forecasted in the future. And so in this project, instead, we're actually trying to refine both spatially and thematically the resolution of this and matching them to the policies. So when you have a policy that talks about nutrient use or fertilizer use and pesticides use and small woody features in landscape, you need to match these in your models that predict the land use change. Otherwise, there is a mismatch between what policymakers talk about and want to hear you talking about, and you can predict instead. So this is what we're doing there, and I'm going to go fast because apparently got only 5 minutes and lots of slides. In these other projects, instead, we are embedding biodiversity as a response function directly in these models. These are economic models, basically optimize profit, typically. And we said, wait a minute, if you want to talk about a just and safe operating space for biodiversity and people, you want to have some kind of biodiversity cost function. And so that's what we do in this project, where basically these optimization models are at the same time maximizing profit, but also equity across different sectors and stakeholders, as well as biodiversity gains. I'm going to go fast over this. Forest Navigator instead is looking only at the forest sector. Bright Space is looking at agricultural sectors. And in this one, essentially, we're diving into the policies that have to do with forests. As I said, multiple different sectors are thinking about forest and forest management. And this one, we're basically going to be providing capacity building and knowledge and tools to have some kind of a modeling suite to think about forest management at multiple scales, from local to pan-European. Resist, Albert mentioned this before, is a strategic initiative project coordinated by Flo Ofanson and Jairi Pioshi. Here we're moving outside Europe, and also we're moving outside from applied science to more kind of a fundamental ecological research. This is a plant functional trait evolution model. The idea is basically that tree species have different evolutionary strategy in terms of resolving the trade-off between being photoactive as much as possible, doing photosynthesis, keeping the stomata open to suck up CO2 from the atmosphere, but also not losing water through evapotranspiration in doing so. And some plants are more drought resilient, so they try to keep the stomata open as much as possible. Some are instead less tolerant. And you can imagine that if you think about hydraulic strategies, at some point with climate change, there's going to be some kind of natural selection of species with different functional traits. In this sense, they're going to basically compete with for water, for nutrients, and for light in different ways. And these communities are going to organize in different ways. And so this model basically is able to kind of investigate this. You have in these videos different late succession of species like this in green basically are able to outcompete the other species that instead are more kind of pioneer, that try with a lot of sunshine and then gets shaded out and then dies off. So this model is able to basically model growth and competition and succession. And so it basically allows us to investigate what happens to these communities under climate change and different soil moisture stress. This is one of those projects that actually we do in collaboration with Israel. And the case study there is actually, there's two case studies. One is about olive groves. How do you manage the water table and these olive trees in ways that basically keep having good yields under water stress? And the other case study instead is about oak forest. And is about essentially how do you make sure that you provide various ecosystem service in this transition between pine plantation to oak forest under future climate change. Okay, so I think I'm gonna have to skip this and then basically briefly talk about equity and justice again. When you manage land for food production, there is also another dimension of this, which is how do you make sure that everyone has got equitable access to water and to land, especially in places like the Bhima Basin in India, where there is water scarcity. The best way to do this is through using agent-based model that actually simulate people behavior. Up until now, they were constrained by the computational complexity of doing so. If you have 1 million agents, good luck running a model that is credible. It's going to take forever to do. But clever people like IIASA managed to actually make this happen. And so we are simulating farmers, reservoir operators, and governments, each of them basically making decisions such as what to plant, when to harvest, and how to irrigate in ways that basically are at the same time equitable, so that make sure that everyone has got equitable access to water resources, both those upstreams and those downstreams, as well as maintaining enough water in the water table, in the groundwater, for rainforests and other ecosystems that depend on this. I'm gonna skip this. I love this graph, but I don't expect you to read through it. But the key message here is that we're gonna bring in more ecology into these ABMs through plant fate, providing hydraulic parameters to the community water model, as well as having species distributions as some kind of a response output out of this work. I'm gonna skip that because I don't have time. One thing that I wanted to mention in terms of data, I mentioned before that we lack this integrated monitoring of everything at the same site. The citizen scientists can come to the rescue in this. Colleague Ian McCallum and his group produce an app called GeoWiki, which they use to do massive citizen science campaign to ask questions such as where are the cereals in the world? So you can download the app, you get presented with a bunch of photos from Google Earth, and you basically ask to identify those. What kind of crop you see there? What is the field size? For instance, this is a paper published a couple of years ago, which was looking at the field size, and all of the data is respecting fair principles, so it's openly available and repeatable and accessible, and can be used to kind of fill up these data gaps that I was mentioning before. And that was my last slide. If people want to ask me about foodscapes, please do, because I missed that slide, but I really want to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions, maybe? Just one. I have very short on time. Yes, please.
No, that's right. Yeah. So in resist, actually, obviously there's a lot about adaptation, because these plants at the same time have both the phenotypic plasticity as well as a phenological adaptation to climate change. So in the sense that they could shed their leaves earlier, or they could bloom earlier. But also for animal species, we know there are more species that are becoming fossorial, or the fossorial species are just surviving better, because of course they can dig down. Aardvarks, for example, apparently have one of the lowest vulnerability to climate change, because they just live 2 meters under the soil, and they can spend more time in the dens. You're right, I think, but then it's not just about learning how they adapt; it's also how to make sure that those species are allowed to adapt, both in terms of dispersing in suitable climate, as well as in having the space to adapt their phenology, becoming more nocturnal, which means less, for instance, light pollution and disturbance in these sites. So absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ramon from the Open Landscape Institute at the Steinhardt Museum of Natural History at Yale University.
Good morning. My name is Orah. I work in the Open Landscape Institute. Just let us remove it. Okay. Which is part of the Steinhardt Natural History Museum, and we are not doing basic science. We are doing. We try to implement what other scientists will provide us, and this, we are collecting data about Israel biodiversity. We have the best botanists going around Israel collecting data, and today I will talk about implementation. We have a few guests from abroad, not too many, but I'll say a few words about our institute and then about Israel in general. The Open Landscape Institute is almost 30 years, and it is a kind of coalition between the Nature and Park Authority and other landscape management in Israel, which would provide them tools to use the data and to do best management of these areas. And we do quite wide range of research talking about multidisciplinary background for planning, and then wildlife corridors, how to plan them, how to manage them. Today I will talk about multi-purpose management. It is quite a complicated subject, and we deal also with stream management and other subjects. Israel is quite fragmented. This is a model which we have developed a few years ago, which gives you see all the infrastructure in a certain area, and each point is becoming greener when it is far from current infrastructure. As you can see, there are very few points which are more than a few hundred meters away from current development. And it's also, at least in central Israel, it is very, agriculture is very much dominant in the space. Means that if you want to go out for recreation, for example, then you are in an open field. And this can go in harmony with agriculture. You can see people walking, and you can see also a conflict. You can see that these cars have gone into the field, destroying the crops. We have to deal with these conflicts, and we have made a kind of research among different holders to see which way are more productive in dealing with these conflicts. Here, for example, one of the main challenges is to use agricultural fields as floodplains. We need floodplains. We have more water coming due to climate change and due to other kinds of development, and we need to curtail the water to prevent floods that will come downstream. And there is a way to do it, but it is partly on agricultural land. As you can see here, this is not far from Netanya, and there is damage. There is damage for this field. So how can we compensate? The farmer is giving us a service. He will hold this water in his field for a few hours, for a few days, and it is quite complicated to give him the proper compensation. I will show a few examples how this compensation was being given to farmers, but right now we are only at the beginning of this way, because most of the farmers now do give us this service without any compensation. This is Bet Netofa Valley, or El Batuf, it is named in Arabic. Most of the farmers who cultivate this valley are Arabs, and you can see that it is a unique heritage, biodiversity hotspot, very important place. And more than that, it is being flooded every few years. There's a big flood covering sometimes 5,000-6,000 dunams in this, and of course, if you talk only about the productivity, agricultural productivity of this valley, it could be drained. It could be drained, and most of the valleys in Israel have already gone through this process, and we cannot see this kind of scenery. And in order to protect it, they made a kind of, the Ministry of Agriculture and other stakeholders provide a kind of insurance to the farmers here, when they can get some compensation at least when such a flood comes every few years. In addition to it, there have been taken some measures to reduce the floods, to make it that it would affect less area, and it will be less frequent. Another example where a single payment was made by the drainage authority to this farmer who owns this field. You see this water passage was planned to smaller, that in case a big flood comes from this stream, it is called Nachal Shezafim, not all the water will go and flood the road and the railway line that comes after this water passage, but it will flood the field. So the farmers, it is Kibbutz Geva, they got almost 1 million shekels, but they gave permanently the rights, and now the drainage authority can cause flood in this field, and it happens once in 2 or 3 years. From another point of view, we look how can we reduce the wildlife damages to the agriculture, because if it does happen, we create a kind of chain, because the farmers want to protect his crops, and then sometimes is putting different kinds of poison that will poison only not only the animals which do harm the field, but other animals which feed on the animals that were being poisoned on the first turn. And from this, the Nature and Park Authority having a very efficient mechanism to help the farmers to meet the farmers' needs in order to avoid these damages. And sometimes, for example, they do hunt or reduce the population of wild boars, which do harm agricultural fields quite severely. And another way, there is a kind of, for example, in the Shikma region where we work, there is a kind of, every time there is a fencing, they try to make the fencing efficient to a certain hazard, and make it possible for animals which are not harming the agricultural crop. And you can see here bad and good examples of fencing. Out of this research, we made a kind of model, a kind of roadmap, not a model, a roadmap, which gives the land managers which kind of compensation, what should they do in different situations. For example, if you have let us talk about the financial resources. If there's no budget, of course, you cannot compensate regularly, but you have to do voluntary initiatives with the farmers. And if it is private land, you can go for acquisition. If it is long lease, short lease, on every situation, there are different measures that you can take to encourage the multi-purpose use. One important thing is not only the compensation itself, but the way you communicate with the farmers. And there are quite a few, we have learned a lot from Liron Israeli about what is the effective way to communicate with the farmers and to meet the needs. And this is something also very important on the way to success. So I'll try to summarize that right now, because we have no financial and statutory background for these steps, it is better to go for voluntary cooperation. It means that we have to care about the farmer's need, to try to reduce the damages which is caused by the natural ecosystems, and in the same way, try to work with the farmers to reduce the damages to the natural ecosystems by the agriculture, by fencing. For example, pest control, integrated pest control. Do regional planning to see that we do not block, for example, all ecological corridors. But for long time implementation, and especially for fly plates, it is required. We need stronger regulation and stable budgeting. And the budgeting is partly here. And the challenge is to channel it to more nature-based solutions. And there is a kind of trade-off. If we go for local and voluntary solutions, sometimes we lessen the need or the ability to go for more fundamental changes that haven't are more difficult to implement. So when we talk about the resources for improvement, so win-win solutions are best. You don't have to invest. For example, you can see now that many of the vineyards and the orchards in Israel are not as barren as they used to be. There is a cover, and it is good for biodiversity, and it is good for the farmers as well. And farmers, part of them are ready to contribute to a certain degree, partly because they are pushed by EU standards, but not only. And nature conservation are very reluctant to allow significant budget to it. The Ministry of Agriculture is more advanced in this context. And if we look at the future about direct payments for ecosystem services, there must be another source of that might help us to promote this process. Okay. There are a few unsolved issues. I'll go forward. One more question is also for our guest. To what extent can we learn and implement methods from abroad? When we began this research, we looked at quite a few European projects which related to the same questions: how to interact with farmers, how to what kind of contracts you can make with them. We got quite a few interesting ideas from these projects, even though direct implementation is quite different because the farmers are different, the statutory and the economic conditions are different, but still we can see that in the future we will have to strengthen this cooperation and learn more from European colleagues.
Orah Moshe is from the Ministry of Agriculture, from the Soil Erosion Research Station.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to speak today on how we can use restoring riparian ecosystems as part of a means of improving many ecosystem services, including habitat diversity. I work for the Ministry of Agriculture in the Department of Soil Conservation in a small research unit called the Soil Erosion Research Station. Our streams are very degraded, especially in agricultural basins, where we lack almost any functional vegetation and almost a complete lack of trees. This has resulted in strongly altering the biotic communities and the habitat that's available. In addition, we have high intensive agriculture in many areas, and this often results in soil erosion and stream bank erosion. And I'll explain why this is uniquely to Israeli conditions, some aspects. So in Israel, as most of you know, we have a Mediterranean climate. Agricultural chemicals are applied starting around February, March, April, all through the spring, summer, and fall until harvest time. So the agricultural chemicals are collecting in the soil since there's no rain. Combining this, we have agricultural practices that frequently leave most of the soil bare at the onset of the rainy season. For example, with rain-fed wheat. So there's no plants that are established yet. You combine this at the beginning of the rainy season, we have high soil erosion. In addition to the sediment itself and the loss of our very valuable topsoil, we're also transporting these agricultural chemicals into our ecosystems, especially through the streams. And this moves both in dissolved chemicals and also with the process of erosion, adsorbed chemicals that are bound to the sediment itself are also transported and deposited into the streams, thus degrading water quality and removing our valuable topsoil. And this is an example of what our streams look like in the winter, which is showing high suspended sediments in the stream. I'm not going to spend much time doing part of what I look at, which is characterizing storm flows. This is a bit of a knowledge gap in Israel since most of the national monitoring is conducted in the spring and in the fall. But because I just explained, most of the agricultural chemicals that have accumulated are really transported in the winter flows. And just as an example from some of my recent work, I'm showing here from a study that I conducted in the Kishon Basin in December of 2020. And the takeaway message here is just showing you the number of different pesticides, which I categorized into fungicides, herbicides, and insecticides, and the total concentrations. And the important point is that in every location, in 25 locations that I monitored, I found an average of 35 different types of pesticides, both dissolved and sediment bound. And these, if you look at, will have strong impacts on aquatic biota directly through insecticides and by adversely impacting primary production in the herbicides, the impact of the herbicides. So one solution to these issues that I've just explained is vegetation buffers. These are, as I showed already, highly degraded, and we can restore the area adjacent to streams and restore native plant species, and with them, all of the ecosystem services that come with it. And my particular interest is in looking at the ecosystem services that are provided by individual plant species. And some of that has already come up for discussion by targeting strategically ones that might be particularly beneficial for improving infiltration and reducing flood issues, for example. So this effect of restoring the riparian ecosystem has cascading effects, and we're looking at that through all the different processes, both fluvial processes and ecosystem services. So, and by bringing trees and other native species back to the streams and looking at all the different potential benefits. So I just want to speak for a moment about how riparian ecosystems provide some of these services and give a few examples. So the first one to begin with is how this restoration will affect channel morphology. I do geomorphology as well, and I'm going to speak about that a little bit at the end, but specifically looking at the role of woody species and native herbaceous and shrub species in terms of improving hydromorphological processes, improving stream bank stability, increasing the wetted areas, these things that improve hydrologic connectivity and retain water in our streams in a system like we have in Israel. It's really critical and can affect the survivability of these species. It also increases sediment capture and helps to build the soil. These will all have roles on habitat creation. So there's been many studies now that show how riparian ecosystem restoration significantly improves the ecological status of degraded streams. It creates a variety of different pools and different habitats. In terms of the geomorphic units, it improves different heterogeneity. It supports mycorrhizal fungi. It increases the habitat both for aquatic and terrestrial species. And many studies have shown, including this one recently, that there's immediate benefits to the macroinvertebrate community, both in terms of total biomass and taxa richness. And so this is a very, has already been demonstrated as a very effective means of improving habitat biodiversity. And as Ori pointed out, can be a win-win for the farmer in terms of understanding where he has degraded lands, marginal lands that are not very productive, and we can compensate the farmer through the ministry and provide some subsidy to help him or her improve farming practices and provide habitat. And just to speak for a moment about the benefits to climate change, we know that climate change we are already seeing the effects here in Israel. And restoring the riparian ecosystem has many effects that will improve ecosystem resilience. Specifically, the ones I'm targeting are looking again at flood reduction. So lowering flood risk by adding hydrodynamic complexity, increasing infiltration capacity and groundwater recharge, and also reducing floods, especially on our downstream areas, and working with the farmer, as Ori pointed out, in this win-win situation to allow some storage capacity. Also, just to point out that they provide shade. When we increase plants on the streams, it provides shade, and shade is very important in climate change. We have already seen the effects in the corals, in corals, that a change in 2 degrees Celsius had a huge impact on coral bleaching, wreaking devastation on the coral communities. So any kind of thing that we can do to buffer some of these impacts and reduce the effect of increasing temperature on stream may have very important results as well. And we know that riparian habitats, because of this, the unique habitat there, are some of the most threatened habitats. And we can see that, especially in Israel, this is going to be increasingly important as we expect to see longer drought periods and more intensive rain events. So I'd like to share with you now 3 case studies of looking at riparian ecosystem restoration. Here's an example of what the stream looks like in its very degraded form. And here's an example of how we can restore it. And again, this work is being done in the Kishon Basin. Here are the study sites. And here's the location of Kishon Basin in terms of Israel overall. So there's 3 studies I'm going to speak about. And the first one is Nahal Kani. This is being led by my student, PhD student, Ramon Israeli. Who you just heard about in some of his other work with working with farmers to overcome the willingness to improve the willingness to adopt strategies. So the objective of this study was flood reduction, soil conservation, and habitat creation. This is a project that we had a farmer who was volunteering to participate, partially because of his relationship with the Cotton Board and a need to demonstrate habitat improvement. So some of this work is focused on that. And also this was looking at using flow accumulation models. If you're not able to do a continuous area of riparian ecosystem restoration and you need to target it, it's developing models where you can selectively target and prioritize areas. And so that's part of what this study was also testing. And the other component that we looked at is geomorphic restoration based on the history that we have of trapezoidal channels in order to accommodate 10-year flood flows. This work was done over decades, and now we understand that this has resulted in disconnecting our floodplains, and it doesn't provide the diversity of habitats. And how a 3 or 4-stage channel design will provide many benefits. So we did this at Nahal Kani, and this creates opportunities for different hydro periods, different species and habitats. And that's how we designed the specific plant species selection based on an understanding overall of the ecosystem services that they could provide and targeting specific ones. For example, you can see the below ground biomass, looking at trying to optimize soil cohesion as one of the primary objectives. So we're strategically targeting different plants based on the ecosystem services they could provide and the hydro period. And Liron led this work. And looking again, a big piece of this effort is looking at the resulting habitat creation. And specifically, he's looking at different aspects, looking at bioacoustic surveys, animal tracks, and some of the indicators like soil moisture changes and leaf litter improvements. Now I'd like to speak about the second project. This is at Nachal Tzipori. It's part of a larger restoration project with many different aspects. And here we are looking at also channel morphology changes. I'm working with Dr. Yaron Hershkovitz and a team of ecologists. And we have many different aspects that we're looking at biodiversity and habitat creation. And the last project I'll speak about just very briefly is at Nahalal. This is a 1 kilometer project where we're restoring native biodiversity, starting with the plant species. We chose 8 perennial herbaceous species. And there's a lot of different aspects that we are improving. We have 2 entomologists on the team, Dr. Liora Shatliel and Dr. Asaf Sedeh, that partner on this project. And also Dr. Roe Igozi is leading a project in the whole upper part of this basin where there's tree planting and habitat creation through owl houses, as you can see this beautiful barn owl here. And the tool that I use to capture sediment and runoff to look at both quality and the ability of different plant species to trap and capture eroded particles also has another benefit, that it functions as a pitfall trap. Here you can see this shrew that luckily survived being captured in my pitfall trap, and we were able to release, but it's another tool. We are looking at spatial connectivity and how to maximize target the locations for riparian ecosystem restoration on a larger spatial scale. And again, focusing specifically on ecosystem services that can be provided to provide multiple benefits. So you can see here that the restoring riparian ecosystems is an important tool for increasing biodiversity and improving many ecosystem services. And I'll just finish by sharing that we spoke in the beginning about the need for standardized methodology. I worked together with several other scientists to customize the morphologic quality indicator. This is something from Italy that targets the Water Framework Directive and meeting good water quality standards. And after completing it and adopting it to Israeli conditions, our conclusion is that it needs to be multidisciplinary, and we are expanding it now with the help of the Kishon Drainage Authority, and they helped to hire support. So we have a macroinvertebrate biologist and a plant ecologist, and we do this all together now. And we're trying to integrate our results as part of the earlier discussion. So I look forward to advancing these conversations. My work is really focused on ecosystem resilience and targeting multiple objectives and looking for system analysis tools. So I look forward to discussing those together. Thank you so much for listening.
Time for one question. Maybe I'll ask one then. And it's actually for all the 3 speakers that already spoke. So how do we take the idea of this session is also to try and find the links between what is done in IIASA on a high level, macro level, and what is done in the field in many of your sites. What kind of lessons, how do we integrate results, thinking, ideas coming from those micro levels to a very high level kind of modeling where we look at continents or regions, or how could we bring those knowledge together because of this varying scales of interactions?
So I'll try to answer that based on your talk. is there were a few of the models that you've already developed that I think that could be applied to take some of these data and some of my results and implement it on a much larger spatial scale. Israel's a small country, and so we could look at some of the spatial analysis. For example, looking at your project, looking at the rooting strategies and the water retention. This would be a perfect collaboration in my eyes. Also looking at the systems analysis of some of the benefits, looking at some of the spatial connectivity models, perhaps looking at the role of restoring riparian ecosystems in terms of carbon sequestration, that you already have some of these models developed. And again, how we can target these to really optimize our very small land opportunities to maximize a win-win for everybody. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Francesca Falco from Tel Aviv University School of Zoology. She's going to be giving her talk on Zoom.
Hi, thank you. I'm sharing the screen. Oh, no, yeah.
Oh, yeah, we can. No, sorry. Hold on. Okay.
You see that? You can see the slides. Good. You hear me well?
This is okay. We can see it. Okay.
Great.
Okay, Francesca, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for hosting me from remotely. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland now. So I'm connecting from here. I'm from the lab of Professor Tamar Dayan. And we present today a project that we're doing on conservation policy design, in particular on the potential of area-based measures for protecting heterogeneous farmland. And so to explore this potential, we use a case study from the Natura 2000 network of protected sites. So we're in the European Union, so we're going back to a kind of continental scale. So first of all, just I changed the slides, yeah. Just a few words about the context of the study. I think we all agree here that agricultural land is not a degraded ecosystem, it could be sometimes, but in Europe as well as in Israel, thousands of years of agriculture actually shaped the open landscapes, and this led to species that now rely on agricultural land for their survival. So among them, we know there are providers of crucial ecosystem services, including pollination and pest control, so crucial for agricultural production itself. And again, they are strongly dependent on a certain degree of land management of agricultural land. So the role of farmland is also acknowledged in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It's still in the draft form, but will be approved hopefully soon in the next few days, actually, in Montreal. Target 10 requires the conservation of farmland biodiversity. And in this project, we try to focus on Target 10, but also we combine it with Target 3, which instead requires that at least 30% of the land will be covered by 2030 by some kind of area-based measure. And we saw also for Piero's presentation that the European Union already integrated this target in its biodiversity strategy. So, and globally anyway, we need to increase the extent of area-based measures. So we try to conceive and assess what an area-based measure would look like in farmland. And here comes the concept of OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures. I'm sure many of you know already. It is now being adopted officially by the Convention of Biological Diversity. And these are areas, OECMs, that are other than nature reserves, whose main purpose is not nature conservation. In our case, it would be agricultural production, but nevertheless, they are governed and managed in ways that achieve a positive long-term conservation outcomes as a byproduct of another management. In the European Union, for example, there are already indicators that can be used to identify possible core areas for conservation, and others are being developed. So a farmland network of OECMs could give a sort of spatial landscape scale framework to agri-environmental measures that are already provided under the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union, and which are now instead targeted on the farm scale, which is a weakness from the point of view of their effectiveness. So the question is how farmland OECMs would work. And to answer this question, we designed a case study based on the Natura 2000 network of protected areas. Most of you already know about it. It's an area-based conservation measure that covers almost 18% of all the EU land, and it's based on a land sharing approach. So anthropic activities are allowed and take place in most of these sites. An important point is that the network is not specifically targeting, it's not designed for farmland biodiversity, but still 40% of the network is in agricultural land, and this also represents 10.8% of all farmland in the EU, so quite a large share. So by looking at this selection of agricultural sites, we believe that we can draw some general conclusions on how area-based conservation would work in farmland. And in particular, we decided to focus on how Natura 2000 affects heterogeneous farmland cover. Since we know that now from vast literature, the landscape complexity, landscape heterogeneity is a key factor for biodiversity conservation in farmland. And it also indicates to a certain extent the extensive management of agricultural land, which is also beneficial to biodiversity. So to understand the relationship between Natura 2000 and heterogeneous farmland, we proceeded in this way. We first selected a set of Natura 2000 sites with certain characteristics and their buffers of 5 kilometers as a control group. We then selected 4 land cover classes from the Korean database that maximize heterogeneous farmland and minimize intensively managed land. And then we gathered data over the 4 available and comparable time period layers of the Korean land cover for each Natura 2000 sites and for their buffers. And finally, we built our panel dataset with repeated observations over time for each site, and we applied a fixed effect model to assess the effect of Natura 2000 on farmland heterogeneity. These are, you can see in the picture, I don't know if you see it with good resolution, anyway, you can see the protected sites that were selected and their buffers around. As per the actual criteria of the selection, so first of all, we selected only the protected sites that were designated under the Habitat Directive between 2006 and 2010, which allows us to have observations both before and after their inclusion in the protected network. We also excluded sites that were already protected, in particular under the old bird directives. However, I must say that it's not completely avoidable because, of course, protected areas are not selected randomly. And other characteristics are that the majority of the area is agricultural land and includes heterogeneous farmland. And we also chose a minimum area of 200 hectares. So as a minimum extent of a landscape unit. This makes sure that the area-based measure, it has a landscape scale application. And this is the treatment group. And we then selected buffers of 5 kilometers around each Natura 2000 site. And we use them as a control group with the assumptions that they have a similar characteristics to the neighboring protected sites. We then created our dependent variable that is meant to include areas that are highly heterogeneous, as I said, and not managed intensively. So they offer a suitable habitat for farmland biodiversity. We did this by choosing 4 land cover classes from the Korean database: the pastures, complex cultivation patterns, land principally occupied by agriculture with significant areas of natural vegetation, and agroforestry. The data are available as a comparable raster layers for 4 years, 2000, 2006, 2012, and 2018. So given that we chose the sites designated between 2006 and 2010, as I said, we have 2 observations before and 2 after the designation as a protected site. So we computed the class area of heterogeneous farmland for each year, and we use it as an outcome in our statistical analysis. And you can see already, just plotting the data before regressing, the trends over time, you can see that Natura 2000 sites in green are almost stable in terms of heterogeneous farmland for the whole period, while the buffers are decreasing steadily, although slowly, because it changes less than 2%. But the trend is very evident. And the regression outcomes actually confirm this and provide confidence intervals. You can see in the effect coefficient in the first graph. On the left, you see the effect coefficient of the Natura 2000 treatment. You can see the effect becomes statistically significant only after the official designation from 2012 and 2018. And then in the other graph, we see I plot the marginal means. It shows that we can interpret the graph as showing the evolution over time of a hypothetical site that has an average, that starts with an average area of heterogeneous farmland cover. And we see how it changes over time under the two scenarios, the two options, being inside or outside the Natura 2000 network. And so we understand a few things from this analysis. First, that outside the protected areas, there is a slowly but steady decreasing trend. We know that land cover changes are in general slow processes, but comparing these results with the literature, it seems that actually the decreasing curve was much steeper in the decades before 2000. This maybe is due to the changes and the reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy and a more environmental towards more environmental objectives also. But anyway, the problem with heterogeneous farmland is that when it's lost basically, because it's not a natural phenomenon. It's the result of both natural and anthropic action over centuries. So it's not going to be recreated, at least as we know it now. So that is why important to preserve it every hectare a bit. And but on the other hand, we see a stable situation within protected sites. They look like shielded from the factors that are driving the decrease in the buffer areas. And so it's worth noting that if we just look at the trends, as I said, it seems that the stable situation was already there even before the designation official. And this would make sense, of course, considering that some kind of previous informal local protection could have been in place, even if we try to exclude it. But on the other hand, from the statistical analysis, also, it appears that the stable pattern is only statistically significant after 2012, so after official designation. So this means that it's only from that moment on that we can really be certain of a real difference between protected and buffer sites. And just as an additional comment, we also added GDP and population density as a regional GDP and population density at NUTS2 level as independent variables in the model, but they turned out either non-significant or with a negligible effect, so not much information from those. And so in conclusion, we can say that Natura 2000 effectively preserved and maintains preserved heterogeneous farmland compared to its buffers. And this may be due to several factors. First, the fact that these obligations for farmers within Natura 2000 are more restrictive than protected in the protected sites than the basic ones that are applicable outside. Is basically called the conditionality of the Common Agricultural Policy. So there is a difference in the intensity of the regulation. And then a second point, that being part of a site under area-based measure might somehow spur stewardship and collaboration among farmers. And there are interesting studies actually that point in this direction. And finally, the landscape scale implementation of the area-based measure is expected to boost effectiveness of the conservation action, as its requirements apply to all farmers within the site. And implementation so is not fragmented as it still happens for the Common Agricultural Policy agri-environmental measures. So in this regard, yeah, the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, has been just reformed. No significant steps have been taken, unfortunately, towards a stronger landscape approach. measures are still meant to be implemented mostly at the farm scale, which is a weakness from the point of view of their potential effectiveness. So the result of this study suggests that using area-based measures might fill the gap, like providing a landscape scale framework to preserve core areas of farmland with high natural value. And yeah, thank you.
Time for 2 questions. Yes, yeah, you need to come. Oh, I can.
Thanks, Francesca. Sorry, I may have missed it, but I was wondering if one of the covariates was also the presence or absence of a management plan for the Natura 2000 site. And then,
Sorry, I cannot hear you very well. Maybe there is a microphone that works.
Nope. Is it better now?
I hear very blurred.
Can you hear us now?
Yes.
It's probably my Italian accent, sorry. Maybe I should just talk in Italian to you. I was just wanted to ask if you used the presence or absence of a management plan for the site as a covariate. And then another question is, what would be then your recommendation given your findings, both in terms of national CAP strategic plans and the implementation of the directives to basically improve the heterogeneity and the protection of basically diverse farmlands? Thanks. And well done, really good study.
Thank you. Yeah, so the first point is that if I understood correctly, is if I took into consideration the fact their management plan is implemented in the sites. So not actually many sites do not have a management plan in place. So my analysis is based just on the fact that there is a basic regulation that applies to all Natura 2000 sites. Of course, where there is a management plan, you have a site-specific landscape scale regulation so it's even better. It's site-specific, but it's not the case for all of them. It would be interesting to have like detailed data for each site, if there is or there is not, and the state of implementation also of the management plan. But it's not required for all of them. So yeah, it would be interesting to match the existence of a management plan and with the trends of the site over time, and see if it makes the difference. Yeah, probably also in this regard, it would be interesting to have the next Korean data in a few years and see how in the future this is progressing. And for the second point, so the suggestion for the strategic plan, the national ones, I think, yeah, from our study, I think the best thing would be to think of areas that have a special importance has a high natural value farmland. There is already indicators. There is already indicator in this sense. There are other indicators. There's also an indicator of farmland heterogeneity, but these are just like pictures in time. The problem with these indicators is that there is no there are no time periods available. So but just to understand where are the areas that requires the stricter conservation, I think we have indicators for the whole Europe, so all countries can use them to build their strategic plans, thinking of some kind of spatial planning of farmland in view of preserving farmland that cannot be restored after, because this is the problem. While natural areas are quite not easy, but let's say there is a process we know about. It is to restore it. Heterogeneous farmland and in general extensively managed farmland is very much harder to restore later when it's lost.
Thank you very much, Francesca. We're going to move to our next speaker. next speaker is Yael Mandelik from the Faculty of Agriculture in the Hebrew University. She's also going to be joining us through Zoom.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't share screen because Francesca is sharing. Yeah, okay. Okay, so,
Thank you, Yael.
okay,
You have 15 minutes.
okay. Good morning. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to present the work I do. So I focus on biodiversity and ecosystem services, using mainly pollinators and pollination services as a main model system to study different aspects of the link between biodiversity and services. And I want to use this system to demonstrate a few of the main topics that we are addressing. So a common or a dominant approach in sustainable agriculture, as previous speakers highlighted, is land sharing, promoting both biodiversity and productivity in agricultural lands. And the main point here is that in order to share both the productivity and biodiversity conservation, we need the common platform is managing for ecosystem services, because this way we can manage or compile both goals. And in principle, when we want to apply land sharing, we are dealing with three aspects of managing for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, and productivity. And of course, this opens the opportunities for win-win situations, but also big challenges need to be confronted. So in order to promote the win-win options, we need first to evaluate the ecosystem services provision, and to see how the extent of services provided and how stable they are. And if indeed we have the potential for considerable provision of services, then we can move to trying to think of how to enhance these main providers of ecosystem services, acting and providing these services in agricultural fields. So my study addresses these different topics, and again, the models constructed, the model system I use is pollination and pollinators. Besides being important by themselves, they provide a very instructive model system for other important ecosystem services providers. And therefore, and therefore, I will use them to highlight more general aspects. So due to time limits, I will just quickly show you a few global scale analysis done on the evaluation of ecosystem services, and some work that we did here in Israel, to just highlight where we stand at this point. So just very briefly, why should we care about pollination services? We should care about it because it's essential both for natural systems. The majority of the world flowering plants need these services in order to reproduce. And if we want to have these nice blooming landscapes, we need them active. And in agricultural systems, pollinators are crucial for the human diet. They provide more than 75% of they affect the quantity or the quality of more than 75% of the leading crop plants. And this sums up to more than 1/3 of the human global diet. So very important economically, nutritionally, ecologically indeed. If we zoom into crop pollination in agriculture, so these are the main agricultural pollinators also in nature. They co-evolve with this ecological task. Most of the farmers today rent honeybee hives at considerable cost, which are increasing from year to year almost. In different parts of the world, the number of these honeybee hives have declined, and it is an ongoing phenomena, nothing new here. In the past decades, it was due to the cumulative effects of parasites, diseases, pesticides. And in the past 15 years or so, the term the colony collapse disorder, which is a major decrease in the number of honeybee colonies in various parts of the world, and all these increase the risk. First of all, it increased the prices for crop pollination in large parts of the world, and the concern over crop pollination prices also increased. I'm sorry for the noise. It increased, especially in sensitive crops such as almonds, which require a high intensity of pollination in sensitive periods in terms of pollinators' activity at the end of the winter. So all these crop pollination crises and the awareness of the continuous decrease in pollinators in both managed and wild pollinators increased the public awareness. And here are just a few examples of initiatives to increase the awareness. So here at the top, how are the shelves of the vegetables and fruits in our supermarkets are going to look like without the pollinators, so eliminating all the crops that are dependent on the activity of pollinators. And this is how our breakfast plate is going to look like without pollinators. So basically, we're not going to starve, but our diet is going to be much less diverse and much less nutrition. And here at the bottom, a few initiatives, so different certificates for farmers that promote pollinator diversity, activity, conservation in their farms. Even McDonald's joined this effort in designing a beehive and placing them on the roofs of their restaurants, and different rallies and demonstrations in Europe and other places. So over the years, as I said before, this is an ongoing problem, and over the years there were different solutions suggested, including both hand or mechanic pollination, as you can see here, or hormone application. And these, of course, were efficient for a few crops, but in many cases not efficient for many other crops, and their cost effectiveness is sometimes not positive. Other way of handling it was to try to rear other commercial bees like bambus, osmia, megachile. And again, these are efficient for some crops, but they don't provide a wider solution for a wide set of crops. So another way to approach this cross-pollination crisis was to look at the potential cross-pollination services provided by wild populations of native bees that inhabit the landscape around the fields and orchards. As you can see here, this bee hotel that was placed in the edge of a field in the US, and these are the emerging bees from their nest in the beginning of the spring. So these wild bees are one of the most diverse orders of animals, insects in specific, with more than 20,000 bees known worldwide, and specifically Israel is a global hotspot of bee diversity with more than 1,100 bee species. We have a nice diversity of species to rely upon, with different phenologies and activities and behaviors. So I want to show you here some work done on the extent of quantifying the extent of ecosystem services provided by these wild bees. So first, this is a major meta-analysis conducted a decade ago, quantifying globally the pollination services provided by honeybees versus wild bees. So you can see here the different, on the left upper side, the different study system, both intensive, extensive. Here at the bottom, the watermelon system in Israel. This is our study system that was included in this meta-analysis. And here in the map, you can see the different locations with the different proportion between wild bees and wild bee and honeybee activity in each study system. So you can see it's very diverse. And on the graph, you can see the different study system on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the link between pollinator activity and fruit set. So the higher the value, it means that higher bee activity is more strongly associated with higher fruit set. And what we can see here is that for all the study systems, the link between wild pollinators and fruit set was strong, was high, and higher than the zero line, meaning that in all of these study systems, the more wild bee activity, the higher fruit set. Whereas for the honeybees in the green dots, we can see that only in some of these systems, more honeybee activity translated into higher crop production. And in many others, it was not significantly different from the zero line. So indeed, at the global scale, we see that wild pollinators here, bees, provide a significant amount of crop pollination services. And here, another meta-analysis a few years later with a similar approach, but here we studied non-bee crop pollinators. And these are mainly flies, not only, but mainly flies. Again, a meta-analysis, a large volume of crops and study systems. And here you can see on the x-axis the different study systems, and the different colors represent the relative number of visits contributed by different orders of insects. And you can see as we move to the right side that more and more non-bee visitors provide the majority of visits. And on the figure on the graph at the lower part of the screen, you can see the relative contribution to fruit sets of honeybees, other bees, and non-bees. Again, these are mainly flies. And we can see that both other bees and non-bees, flies, provide a significant contribution to a fruit set based on the distance between their average, the slope and the zero line. So both bees and non-bees, mainly flies, provide considerable crop pollination services at a global scale. Another aspect that was tested in a more recent meta-analysis, again, the Israeli crop systems were included in these studies.
Yael,
Here we
you
were
have 1
interested in
minute.
seeing not the amount of pollination services, but their stability, which is not less important in terms from the farmer perspective. They want to have as stable as possible, both spatially and temporally, as stable as possible pollinator activity. On the pie figures demonstrate the different orders of insects that were active in the different study sites based on sites and fields on the two
Yael,
the two
you
figures.
have one
And
minute left.
the two graphs demonstrate the negative pattern. So as you move along the x-axis from the left to the right, we have more and more diverse study systems. So the pollinator communities were more diverse. And on the y-axis, you can see a measure of the interannual variation. So the lower, so as we move along the x-axis, we see that more and more diverse pollinator communities provide more stable pollination activity, both in terms of pollinator abundance and pollinator species richness. So more diverse pollinator communities are more stable in terms of their activity in field crops, which again is a very important insight. I will just, this is my last slide that I want to show. So as I showed you before, Israel, a global hotspot of pollinator diversity, and we wanted to evaluate the potential of the delivery of these very diverse pollinator communities across Israel's open landscapes. And since we lacked data on many regions of the country, we did that using expert-based scoring, taking into account the availability, the spatio-temporal availability of floral and nesting resources, and decreasing the ranking based on relative pesticides use. And you can see here the different land use or cover types that we mapped. And the map, the darker the color, the higher potential for the delivery of crop pollination services. So with this, I conclude, and I want to thank these funding agencies and collaborators, and to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We are a little bit short on time, so we're going to move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Rotem Zellinger from IIASA, and she'll be talking about food security, an accessible tool for analyzing and forecasting agricultural commodity prices. Put this on share screen.
I'm a postdoctoral fellow at IIASA. I'm part of the Advancing System Analysis program. So the Advancing System Analysis program goals are to identify, develop, and deploy new systems, analytical methods, tools, and data. Also to address the most pressing global sustainability challenges and to find solutions to those challenges that are both realistic and appropriate. The program has 4 groups. These are the 4 groups. So these are the EM, SYRR, NOTS, and CAT. I'm mainly part of the EM group. So today I'm going to present you my personal project, which deals with analysis and forecasting of global agricultural commodity prices. We start from the bottom, from the basic problem of seeing the problem that food prices are simply not stable. Then we think about many possible reasons that can cause to the food price changes. We study the problem. Then model agnostic means that we try to see what happened within the model that led to the results. And when we'll get to the end, I hope that you will all understand. So here we see 3 price indices. We see the food in green, energy in grain in blue, and energy in pink. We see 3 things. First is the very high correlation between food prices and grain prices. They always move together. That means that when we know what's going on in the grain markets, we necessarily know what's going on in the food markets. Then we see that during the past few decades, the same also goes for energy. And third, and now let's focus on the past few years, we see that we are in time of great inflation. Prices are rising. But these are general food, general price indices. What is most important for food security, it's actually the food price for the consumers. So this is the Consumer Food Price Index of the FAO, and the purple is the World Consumer Food Price Index. We see that there is a global inflation. Below it, there are 2 lines of high-income countries. So we have Western Europe and Northern America. And high above it, it's low-income countries. Well, so here we can understand how sensitive they are to every shock in the global market. They are much more sensitive than high-income countries. And on top of that, we can basically understand that although that today there are many models that forecast prices, analyze prices, they are just not accessible to the low-income countries. From that, I personally want to make it accessible to allow these low-income countries to understand what's going on in the food markets, the global food markets. So we saw that there is an evident problem, and now we think about the possible causes to it. This is an overview of the model. On the top, we have the model input. So each time I try to analyze and forecast the price of a unique agricultural commodity. Today I will focus on maize, that is corn. And on the top, we have, I always use historic prices of the crop that I analyze, then either production or yield in one of possible geographic scales. So it's domestic, regional, by continent, or in one big and important country. Then also stocks, and then for each crop, there are specific or unique variables only for this crop. It can be GDP, the prices of other agricultural commodities or other commodities such as energy, fertilizers, etc. Climate data, farm prices, future prices, really whatever variable that you can think of. All these train, the model is trained on them to forecast or to understand the price of the commodity. Then we move to actually studying the problem. How do I study it? I integrate econometric and machine learning models. The model works, the tool actually, it works in 3 stages. First, it's to choose the variable. So I filter the data. Second is to identify the price, and that is a retrospective analysis of the price. And third, it's to forecast the price. Just to show very briefly, there are 2 types of price analysis and forecasting. There is first regression, so to see relative changes in the price, and classification, so it's whether the price will increase or decrease. These are the models that I use. Don't worry, I'm not getting into details. I just said that these are econometric and machine learning models. And to assess the accuracy of the model, I use for regression the RMSE. RMSE is the root mean squared errors. And for classification, the area under the curve. Very briefly, let's see the RMSE. Here is an example. So instead of using the RMSE, it's basically the difference between the observed price and the forecasted price. The lower this difference is, that means that the model performs better. So here, the line means that the error is equal to the standard deviation of the price. And from that, we know that our model doesn't do anything. Any point above the line, that means that our model is effective. And below it, that means that the model is not effective. The higher we get, that means that our model performs better, and we would choose the model that is on the top. I just want to say that this RMSE, it's not a unique value. I choose it according to the situation in the market. So we forecasted the price, we chose the model, and now we move to the model agnostic of understanding what's going on inside this specific result. I show you just 2 examples. This is SHAP. SHAP, it's the Shapley value for machine learning. That means the marginal impact of every variable on the forecasted price. What we see here, so here on the y-axis is the variables, and on the x-axis is the forecasted price. The variables are ordered according to their relative importance in the model. That means their how much they contribute to lowering the error of the model. The higher it is, the more important the variable is. The point here, each point is a specific observation, where deep purple means positive yield change and yellow means negative yield change. What we see here is that Northern America is the most important variable, again, in the case of the price of maize. And we see that when it produces more, that is the purple, we would expect the price to decrease. And when it produces less, the price will increase. Here, it's the partial dependence plot. It shows the average response of maize price to variations of maize yield in Northern America. Again, we see that when the yield in Northern America is growing lower, is getting lower, the price will increase. And when it's getting higher, the price will decrease. It was very brief, and as I said before, this is my postdoctoral project. It's not done yet. And my goal is to make the price forecasting and analysis a social good, so everybody would understand it and could use it. This will be the first tool to provide medium-term price analysis and forecasting of agricultural commodities in a way that would be useful for all humans. I hope that it will promote understanding of the global food trade to enhance food security and social equity. And one day, when it will be ready, it will be publicly available as an open online platform. And this was just my personal project, but my specialty. I do statistical modeling and applied research using econometric and machine learning methods in many topics: agriculture, food security, environment and ecology, trade, and other. Just a little example, I also work with a tomato lab in the Volcani Institute, and together we try to find tomato cultivars that are heat tolerant. So I'm not a biologist, but my part there is to do all the statistical analysis. If you want to collaborate with me, you're welcome to send me an email, call, as you wish, and thank you.
Yes. I have a question regarding the maize.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing what is going to happen is nice. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And this is what I'm trying to understand. I take two very different markets, like the North American market, where maize is produced mostly for feed of animals,
mm-hmm. and energy.
And Africa, in which it is mostly like 70% is for food for people, and it's also not so much traded because there's a lot of subsistence farming. People are growing for themselves. So my question is, what is the use of your forecast in those two, in such different markets?
So for Northern America, I think it's obvious, because they trade and they export, they import, they produce, and they control it. When the price, for example, will be high, they will export, they can stock. For Africa, well, actually, when you analyze the price within these countries, you see that is very, very correlated to the global price. So there is correlation, and they also big importers of maize. Why did I said rice, but I think maize. Okay. so there are big importers and there are big consumers, and as you said. Well, when they know, for example, that the price will be higher in several months, once they can buy more now and stock it, and two, they can maybe substitute it with another agricultural commodity. Maybe they can buy more wheat, more rice, whatever is cheaper.
They don't eat it because they eat only meat, right? No ugali, no.
So stock it or buy later. Any other question?
Yes, please.
I have actually two questions. One is technical regarding the validation of the model, the general analysis data. But one is just to understand, why are these models not available to poor countries? Is it because of lack of information, or that if you have it on your, or even a lack of access to the internet, or why is it not available? You obviously have it. Why don't other countries around the world?
Right. So more other countries have it. Even Israel has it because the Bank of Israel has some forecasting models, but it costs money, and low-income countries cannot pay for it. And for example, the USDA publishes, and also the World Bank, they publish the forecasted price every month, but it's only a price. They don't say how they do the forecast, and two, they don't say what's going on that led to this price. So we know, for example, let's take the COVID crisis, and we knew, because we read the outlook of the USDA, that the price will increase in 7%. But today China closed their border, and well, we don't know what's going on. The USDA knows because they have the model, but because the model is closed, is kept as secret, we only knew what this model forecasted yesterday, but today there was a big change. That's it. They're lost.
Any further questions? Okay, so I think because it's been a very, very long session, I'm also getting a lot of pressure that we need to leave this room. And the last speaker, which is myself, I will forgo my presentation. And I think we should spend the last few minutes that we have here, and I think that was the main idea of the session, is thinking of, and we started talking about this, about ways of connecting research happening in IIASA and here in Israel. We started talking about some small scale and macro scale connections. But I think if there's other sort of ideas coming from the presentations, I think it's a good time to spend the next few days, the next few minutes before we leave. And so the last few minutes, if you have any last comments on the presentations of ways of collaborating with IIASA, I think it's the best to get it out and do that. Maybe you want to say a few words.
So I think one weakness that we have, at least in the BNR program where I am, is thinking about adaptation strategies. Like we talk a lot about mitigation strategies, how to make sure that we try and improve our natural carbon sinks and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have less of an experience in thinking about adaptation, and most of the talks here had something about insurance and payment for ecosystem services to allow for natural flooding systems and compensate farmers, or ways in which we can think about natural restoration in riverbanks to basically maintain water quality, and as well as minimizing soil erosion. this kind of stuff we don't do and we badly need. We tend to work a lot at large scale, but I'm personally very happy to actually go down to sort of the scale that matters for management decision, which is kind of a field or sort of landscape scale. And we can think about both bottom up and top down. You mentioned maybe we can scale the work that you do up, but we can also try to scale down what we do and think about multi-scale modeling. So this is just a very general, vague suggestion that we can think about, especially adaptation strategies and how to bring them into the kind of models that we do. Just a suggestion.
No, I think you're fine there. I think we can
I
hear
just
you.
want to tackle a little bit because I think one of the things that we want to achieve with this meeting was to increase the interest of the younger generation, FGD, the postdocs, and learning researchers to participate more fully.
Could you just introduce yourself?
I'm Gansen Pillay. I'm a retired professor of microbiology and genetics. I was at the IIASA for 14 years. I was the vice chair for the last 6 years. But I've now stepped down. I was called into the system of the 50th anniversary. And so I worked very closely with Israel. I wasn't the vice for 39 years.
Okay.
After 39 years, I'm coming back. But I worked quite closely with Israel to join and to make sure that they got in. That was in 2017. I now work very closely with Israel and Israeli in negotiating the next 5 years and see what can be in place. I'm not sure what the current technology is regarding the ministry's proposal to the idea is once that comes up, that should form the epicenter for systems analysis in Israel. That acts as an interface, as a hub and spoke model. So the knowledge center being the hub, your spokes are the government ministries, the different universities, IIASA, etc. And I think it's what needs to be built within that is a human capital development program of researchers going, for example, for YSSP. Last year we had 0 applications from Israel. And that's sad because there were lots of eligible students. We haven't had as many postdoctoral fellows, just a few from Israel. So the last 5 years wasn't the greatest, and COVID also impacted upon it. I'm just sharing this with you to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. For example, if you want to understand the gains model better, there can be a workshop that can be arranged, okay? That can take place for interested researchers. If students want to learn how to develop and publish a paper in Nature, we can go through an online course to do that, virtually. Don't have to necessarily be here. Even how to write a research proposal, for example, in systems analysis, that's available. So I think one of the challenges is that not all the people that really need to know it as to what's available. So I'm hoping that the Knowledge Center will be able to disseminate that information as well as opportunities. And there's lots of short-term visits that researchers come on. I mean, if you're a D student and you have a chapter of work that you want to finish, you can match with the appropriate supervisor and depending on the availability, come and spend 3 months at IIASA or 6 months at IIASA and work towards your doctoral degree or your postdoc project. So that's what I want to share with you.
What you're saying, there's a lot of tools that can make this interaction between the organization and a lot of universities here in Israel accessible.
Yes. And it doesn't take a lot.
Various different interactions.
IIASA is a member Israel is a member organization of IIASA and will be for the next 5 years. There's lots of benefits that are available, but the question is that it depends on the member organization to access those benefits. For example, access to models, access to workshops, access to scientific writing, short-term visits, collaborative research, etc. So, I mean, I was on the council, as I said, I represented South Africa. But we were quite fed up at one stage that they only take one YSSP a year. So we created our own for 50 students in sub-Saharan Africa. But we got all the IIASA lecturers to come and lecture the modules. So it can be done.
Okay. Thank you very much for your insights. Any other thoughts, ideas, last comments? Okay, so we're going to end the session. The organizers just wanted me to notify you that now you have, I think, 15 minutes of a break, and we're starting again in room 201 at 12:30, which will be followed by lunch at floor -1 after that session. So thank you very much for all the speakers and for the audience here. Thank you.
Thank you.